Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're going to be making a fairly simple woven bench. Now I wanted to make this project purely because I've seen some really cool shaker style benches or chairs or settles, whatever you want to call them, that are a little bit wider and have this nice woven seat, and some of them even have a backrest, which is just a really cool idea to me. But overall I didn't really understand how the whole structure of this thing is supposed to come together so that it's actually strong enough to support weight. So before I go ahead and build something a lot bigger, a lot more expensive, I wanted to start by making something nice and small. So this very simple bench is made up of 12 different spindles and then 4 legs. So we're going to start by turning the legs and just getting them to a nice shape. I didn't have anything specifically designed for this bench, I just knew that I wanted to have a fairly straight leg with a nice little taper at the end. Now the biggest trick with these legs is getting them all to the same size. Now there's a few different ways you could go about doing this. You could turn them all to, completely different sizes, and then once everything's all glued up, then you could take the time to flatten the base and all that, like you would do with a lot of other types of furniture. But it's also extremely easy on the lathe. If you just take your time and use your parting tool as accurately as possible, you can get these legs pretty much perfectly sized right on the lathe. And so the only real decoration I'm adding to the legs is just a nice simple round over at the top and then tapering it at the bottom about 2 inches up from the bottom of the leg here. Now the most important part of making any kind of spindle-based structure like we're doing here is that you have your holes accurately drilled. So in this case, all we're doing is just drilling them at 90 degrees to each other. So in the drill press here, I'm just using this little jig to hold the leg in place so that when I introduce the brad point bit to it, it doesn't turn, rotate, or move out of alignment. We're going to keep everything perfectly perpendicular to each other. For the spindles, we're going to be using properly riven stock. Now what this means is that we need the grain to basically be following from one end to the opposite end of the spindle, because our spindles are only going to be about 1 inch in diameter at their finished size, so we want to make sure that there's as little run out as possible. So the best way to do this is just to use a froe, a hatchet, an axe, use pretty much any heavy duty cutting tool to just split a board right down the middle. Then you can take this same board and just run that new fresh face over the jointer. And what this will do is it'll just make sure that the grain is running perfectly parallel to that edge. And so it'll mean that your grain is running as straight as possible, and it'll give you a much stronger spindle. Now with these long stretchers, there was a lot of vibrations to them. At this stage, while they're still rough and square, they were fairly stable, which is why I was able to turn just the middle section completely round. So all I'm aiming for in this middle section is to just get it round. I'm not trying to get it down to any kind of final dimensions. I just need to get it to the point where it is perfectly round. because if I tried to work this whole spindle down to its final thickness, by the time I reach that 1-inch diameter, this thing would be vibrating all over the place. So what I'm doing is turning that middle section down to once it hits that round point, and then I can add in the steady rest. Now all the steady rest is, it's just a couple wheels mounted to this weird jaw structure. And so this helps to dampen the vibrations across this spindle. Now in most of the spindles you'll probably turn, you're not going to need a steady rest like this. This is only when you're dealing specifically with these extremely long and narrow spindles. Turning the same spindle, if it was 2 inches thick or even 3 inches thick, really wouldn't be that big of an issue, and I probably wouldn't need the steady rest, just because of that thicker material, there's not as bad a vibration. But once you get down to this 1-inch diameter, and the spindle is about 40 inches long, you really need that hard middle point to help eat up some of those vibrations. Then on the end of the spindles, I'm using this tapered tenon cutter from Lee Valley, and what this is going to do is cut a tapered tenon that will perfectly match the reamed holes that are in the legs. Now this is one of those things that you can technically do it on the lathe by hand. I just found it nearly impossible to get the angles and all that right. Maybe with a little bit of practice in the future I can do it, but I didn't feel like trying to figure that out right now. So using the tenon cutter just made it a lot easier. Then the shorter spindles are the exact same process. The only real difference is just because they're only about 20 inches long, you don't need the steady rest. So we're starting with some nice rivet stock and then taking it over to the lathe from there. The most interesting thing about using these tapered tenons is that as soon as you apply a little bit of pressure, you saw I just did a light tap with the hammer there, they lock perfectly in place to the point where they are pretty much a self-holding joint. So it's just something that I find very interesting, because with just a little bit of pressure inwards towards the joint, these will lock together. But as soon as you apply pressure outwards from that, you tap on the exposed part of the tendon from the outside, the joint will just pop apart. So it made it very easy to put this whole bench together, do the dry assemblies and that I needed to do. And even during the glue up, it just made everything a lot easier. And the last part to add to this bench before we can start weaving the top is just a small support bar right going between the middle of the top two stretchers here. So what this is going to do is going to prevent the stretchers from deflecting inwards, because when somebody sits on the top of this, or even just from the pressure of weaving cotton webbing later on, I was afraid that these two long, thin stretchers would pull in towards each other and would eventually crack just from the pressure. So by adding in this small support piece, it just makes sure that there can be no deflection. Now the one downside of the support piece is that you can't really comfortably sit in the middle of this bench. You're going to feel that piece of wood pretty much no matter where, no matter how thin I made it, you're still going to feel it. So typically anyway, when you're sitting on a bench, you're going to sit on the left or the right side, so I don't think it's that big of a deal, but it's one of those things if you're trying to mimic this design, if you want to avoid having to add in this piece, I can recommend making your top two stretchers maybe a little bit thicker so that they have less deflection to them. For the glue up, I'm using hide glue. So the idea here is that anytime you spend, days or hours turning a whole bunch of spindles, you want to make sure that you can eventually take that project apart if something breaks. Because like I've said a few times, these are fairly thin spindles, and especially the long ones are very prone to breaking. So I'd much rather not have to throw out this bench when one of those spindles breaks, and instead I can just take it apart because I'm using hide glue here, and I can replace that spindle pretty quickly and easily. For the seat, I'm just using some generic 1-inch cotton webbing, and so we're going to be using two different colors here. On the long side, we're going to be starting with black, and then on the short side, we're going to be doing a dyed green. So all I did was just buy some white cotton webbing and then spent the time to dye it green. Now, in hindsight, this was a much harder process than I thought it would be, and I would probably try to find pre-dyed webbing first, just because even if it's a little more expensive, in the long run, you're probably going to save money if you just buy it pre-dyed, and it's going to work out a little bit better. But one of the lessons that I learned when weaving this seat is that I should have started with the short side rather than the long side. Because if I'd started with that short side, it would have been a lot easier to get this filler piece in, because what ended up happening is there ended up being a lot of filling on one side of the bench and not quite enough on the other side. So once I got everything woven together, I was able to even it out a little bit, but it definitely would have been a lot easier if I just done it in the opposite way that I did it. And so you can see here that I decided to bring in a little bit of a pattern. Now, if you look at a lot of old school shaker style chairs, there generally is a pattern to them. They don't just do a normal checkerboard kind of weave to them. They have some either herringbone or cross or diamond pattern to them. So I'm not really sure what you would call the pattern that I chose to do here. All I know is that it looks pretty cool.